I'm Allie, your host for today's mystery. We're joining Miss Jane Marple at a genteel retirement home in the English countryside, where the jealous fire of Warbling wood burns. This is a tale of long-buried secrets, decades-old heartbreak, and the dangerous power of unresolved grief. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from today? Let me know in the comments. Settle in with a warm cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's ease into it. Miss Marple and the Jealous Flame of Warbling. Wood Chapter 1. A Gathering at Warbling. Wood Miss. Jane Marple stepped carefully from the taxi cab, her keen blue eyes taking in the dignified facade of Warbling Wood Manor with quiet appreciation. The ancient country house, with its weathered stone and climbing roses, had changed little since her last visit some 15 years ago, though its purpose had altered considerably. What had once been the private estate of the Carmichael family was now a most exclusive retirement home for those of good background and comfortable means. "Oh, Jane, how wonderful to see you after all this time," called Lady Harriet westward, descending the shallow stone steps with remarkable agility for a woman of 78. "I was beginning to think you might never accept my invitation." Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her neat hat. "My dear Harriet, one doesn't travel as easily at my age, but I wouldn't have missed your anniversary celebrations for the world." Lady Harriet took her arm with familiar affection. 50 years since old Carmichael's daughter converted the place? Hard to believe. We've planned quite the fete, you know, a proper ball, just like in the old days. As they entered the cool interior, Miss Marple observed the subtle changes that had transformed the once private home into an establishment. The grand staircase remained, but a discreet elevator had been installed alongside it. The massive oak hall table now held a visitor's book and a small bell, while several comfortable chairs had been arranged for those who might need to rest before ascending to their rooms. "We've put you in the blue room," Lady Harriet was saying. "Lovely view of the rose garden. Tea will be served on the terrace in half an hour. Everyone is quite eager to meet you. I may have mentioned your little, successes with puzzling matters." Miss Marple shook her head with gentle reproof. "Really, Harriet, people will think I go looking for such things." "Nonsense. Trouble finds you as it always has," Lady Harriet replied with a twinkle in her eye. "Though I assure you, Warbling Wood is perfectly peaceful these days. Just a few harmless squabbles among the residents. Nothing more exciting than that." After refreshing herself in the charming blue room, which indeed possessed a lovely view of the terrace rose garden, Miss Marple made her way downstairs. She had exchanged her traveling clothes for a pale gray dress with a touch of lavender at the collar, her silver hair arranged neatly beneath a modest lace cap. The terrace presented a scene that might have been lifted from an earlier era. Wicker chairs and small tables had been arranged in the dappled shade of an ancient cedar tree. Silver gleamed, china clinked, and the delicate scent of fresh scones mingled with that of the nearby roses. "Ah, here she is," Lady Harriet beckoned. "Everyone, this is my dear friend, Miss Marple. Jane, let me introduce our little family here at Warbling Wood." A distinguished gentleman with a military bearing rose immediately to his feet. "Colonel Reginald Bastow, miss. Delighted to make your acquaintance." He bowed stiffly, his white mustache precisely trimmed, a regimental tie at his throat despite the warmth of the day. "Colonel," Miss Marple acknowledged with a nod. "How nice to meet a friend of Harriet's." "Mrs. Violet Merriweather," Lady Harriet continued, indicating a slender woman whose posture, even seated, betrayed years of dance training. "Our resident artistic talent, once with the Royal Ballet." "Mrs. Merriweather," supplied the woman. extending a hand adorned with an impressive emerald ring. Though that was many years ago now. One does so miss the applause. And Dr. Edmund Fletcher, formerly of Harley Street, Lady Harriet continued, gesturing toward a bald man with intelligent eyes behind rimless spectacles. A general practitioner only, he demurred. Though in retirement, I find myself still consulted on matters of health by my fellow residents. And finally, our charming Mr. Gerald Hartley, Lady Harriet concluded with a nod toward a handsome man of perhaps 65, whose silver hair and tanned complexion suggested someone who had aged exceptionally well. The pleasure is entirely mine, Mr. Hartley said smoothly, his eyes lingering on Miss Marple with genuine interest. Lady Harriet has told us of your remarkable perception, Miss Marple. Oh dear, Miss Marple said with a slight flush. Harriet does exaggerate so. I'm merely observant, nothing more. Observation is the foundation of all wisdom, quoted Dr. Fletcher approvingly. Though I dare say few observe as keenly as a doctor, or perhaps a lady with your reputation. Tea progressed pleasantly with the easy conversation of those who, if not precisely friends, had at least achieved the comfortable familiarity of shared residence. Miss Marple noticed, however, the undercurrents. Colonel Bastow's gaze frequently returned to Mrs. Merriweather with something like disapproval. Mr. Hartley was attentive to all the ladies present, but particularly so to Mrs. Merriweather, who seemed to alternately encourage and rebuff his gallantries. Dr. Fletcher observed it all with the detached interest of a scientist studying specimens. As the tea things were being cleared away, a young maid approached Lady Harriet with obvious trepidation. Begging your pardon, my lady, but there's been an incident in the portrait gallery. Mr. Simmons thought you should know right away. Lady Harriet frowned. What sort of incident, Mary? It's the founder's portrait, my lady. Someone slashed it with a knife. Right across the lady's face. A shocked silence fell over the terrace. Miss Marple observed the reactions carefully. Colonel Bastow's face flushed with anger. Mrs. Merriweather's hand flew to her throat. Dr. Fletcher leaned forward with sudden interest, and Mr. Hartley's expression became unreadable. How perfectly dreadful. Lady Harriet finally said, who would do such a thing? Miss Marple said nothing, but her bright blue eyes missed nothing as she folded her hands in her lap. It seemed that Warbling Wood Manor was perhaps not as peaceful as her dear friend had claimed. Chapter 2. Whispers from the Past, the Morning Following. The incident with the portrait found Miss Marple taking a turn about the gardens of Warbling Wood. The dew still clung to the roses, and the air held that particular freshness one finds only in the countryside before the day has properly begun. She had always been an early riser, finding that the quiet hours of dawn often provided clarity where confusion had reigned the evening before. The vandalism of the founder's portrait had caused quite the stir. Mr. Simmons, the caretaker, had covered the damaged canvas with a cloth and promised to call a restorer from London, though, as he had said to Lady Harriet within Miss Marple's hearing, "It won't ever be the same, my lady. Some damages can't be undone." A curious choice of words, Miss Marple had thought at the time, almost as if he were speaking of something beyond the portrait itself. "Miss Marple, you're an early bird as well, I see." Miss Marple turned to find Mrs. Violet Merriweather approaching along the gravel path. Despite the hour, the former ballerina was impeccably dressed in a pale blue ensemble, her silver hair arranged in an elegant knot. "I've always found morning to be the most truthful time of day," Miss Marple replied with a smile, "before one has had time to compose oneself, as it were." Mrs. Merriweather laughed, a tinkling sound like small bells. How astute. I confess, I rise early from old habit. When one has spent decades waking for morning practice, the body doesn't forget. They walked together among the roses, exchanging pleasantries until Mrs. Merriweather paused beside a particularly fine bloom of deep crimson. I suppose Lady Harriet has told you that many of us knew each other long before Warbling Wood, she said, her voice suddenly lower. Not that we all advertise the connection, you understand? Indeed. Miss Marple's interest was piqued. I had no idea. Mrs. Merriweather glanced around, though the gardens were quite deserted. Oh, yes. Gerald, Mr. Hartley, and I were in the same social set in London during the 30s. The Colonel as well, though he was rather older and on the periphery. And there were others. She trailed off, absently touching the emerald ring on her finger. It must be pleasant to be among old acquaintances, Miss Marple observed mildly. Mrs. Merriweather's laugh held little humor this time. Pleasant is not quite the word I would choose. Old acquaintances bring old memories, Miss Marple, not all of them welcome. Before Miss Marple could inquire further, they were interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Bastow, who was taking his morning constitutional, with military precision, pocket watch in hand. Ladies, he greeted them with a stiff bow. Magnificent morning, though I hear there's to be a meeting about this ball nonsense directly after breakfast. As if we haven't better things to occupy ourselves with. You're not looking forward to the anniversary celebration, Colonel? Miss Marple inquired. His face darkened momentarily. Frivolous waste of time and resources, particularly this dancing business, at our age. Quite ridiculous. I rather think it's lovely, Mrs. Merriweather countered, a spark of defiance in her eye. Age need not preclude joy, Colonel. Or have you forgotten how to waltz? Something passed between them then, some current of old feeling that Miss Marple couldn't quite identify but noted carefully. I have forgotten nothing, madam, the Colonel said stiffly. Nothing whatsoever. He touched the brim of his hat and continued on his way, back straight as a ramrod. Mrs. Merriweather watched him go, her expression unreadable. The Colonel disapproves of many things, she said softly. Particularly me, I'm afraid. After breakfast, Lady Harriet invited Miss Marple to her private sitting room, once the morning room of the manor when it had been a private residence. It retained its charming aspect to the east, where the morning sun streamed through tall windows onto a collection of comfortable furniture that had known many years of use. I thought you might like to see these, Lady Harriet said, opening an album bound in faded red leather. Photographs from the early days of Warbling Wood as a residence. Some of our current members are even pictured, though much younger, of course. Miss Marple settled beside her friend, spectacles perched on her nose as they turned the heavy pages. There was the manor as it had been, the gardens differently arranged, and groups of elegant people posed on the very terrace where they had taken tea the previous day. There's Violet Merriweather. Lady Harriet pointed to a strikingly beautiful young woman in a long gown. She was quite the sensation in her day. And indeed, even in the faded photograph, one could sense the vitality and presence of the dancer. Beside her stood a handsome young man in evening clothes. And that's Gerald Hartley, Miss Marple guessed. Yes, indeed. Quite the eligible bachelor back then, broke hearts by the dozen, if the stories are true. Miss Marple studied the other, faces in the photograph. And the Colonel, was he present at these gatherings? Lady Harriet turned a few pages, then pointed to another photograph. Here he is, much younger, of course. He came from a good family, but not quite in the same social circle as the others. Military through and through, even then. Miss Marple, Notice that in this photograph, the young colonel stood somewhat apart from the main group, his expression serious even in that festive setting. And just visible at the edge of the frame was another young man, his features vaguely familiar. "Is that Dr. Fletcher?" she asked, pointing. Lady Harriet peered more closely. "Why, I believe it is. How extraordinary. I didn't realize he had connections here from so long ago. He's only been a resident for 3 years." Miss Marple was about to inquire further when they were interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the corridor outside. Lady Harriet closed the album with a sigh. "That would be Mr. Hartley and our newest resident, Mrs. Preston. She only arrived last month, and already she's causing quite the stir." They emerged to find Mr. Hartley and an elegant woman of about 70 engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion near the staircase. The woman, presumably Mrs. Preston, was beautifully dressed in expensive clothes that spoke of both taste and means, her silver hair styled in a contemporary fashion that somehow made the other residents seem slightly old-fashioned by comparison. "I absolutely insist that you stop this behavior at once," Mr. Hartley was saying, his usual charm entirely absent. "It is inappropriate and unwelcome." "Inappropriate?" Mrs. Preston replied, her voice carrying clearly in the paneled hallway. "How fascinating to hear you, of all people, lecture on propriety, Gerald." They became aware of their audience then, and the conversation halted abruptly. Mr. Hartley composed his features into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, Lady Harriet, Miss Marple. May I present Mrs. Eleanor Preston, our newest resident?" "We've met," Lady Harriet said with a certain coolness. "Miss Marple is visiting for our anniversary celebrations." Mrs. Preston's gaze swept over Miss Marple assessingly. "How delightful! Another pair of eyes to witness the festivities. I do so look forward to the ball. It has been years since I've had the pleasure of a proper waltz." She glided away up the stairs with remarkable grace, leaving behind her an atmosphere that Miss Marple could only describe as electrically charged. Mr. Hartley excused himself with rather less than his usual charm, and Lady Harriet shook her head. "That woman," she muttered. "I cannot think why the committee approved her application." Miss Marple said nothing, but as they walked toward the drawing room for the meeting about the ball, she reflected that Warbling Wood was proving to be a place where the past and present were strangely, perhaps dangerously, intertwined. Chapter 3. The final dance, the day of the anniversary ball arrived with a flurry of activity at Warbling Wood Manor. Miss Marple observed the preparations from her window, noting the delivery vans that arrived throughout the morning and the staff hurrying about with flour, arrangements, and additional chairs. Lady Harriet had explained over breakfast that though the celebration was primarily for the residents, a number of local dignitaries and board members would also be attending. "One must keep up appearances," she had said with a slight sigh. "The Carmichael Trust expects a certain standard to be maintained." Miss Marple, seated now in a comfortable chair in the library with her knitting, reflected on the curious atmosphere that had pervaded Warbling Wood over the past 2 days. The vandalism of the portrait remained unsolved, though the matter seemed to have been quietly set aside in the excitement of the coming festivities. Yet she had noticed a certain tension among the residents, a watchfulness that went beyond the usual anticipation of a social event. The door opened and Dr. Fletcher entered, a book tucked under his arm. "Ah, Miss Marple, finding a moment of peace before the evening's excitement?" he asked, selecting a volume from one of the shelves. "Indeed," she replied with a smile. "One appreciates quiet moments at my age." "At all our ages," he corrected, with a dry chuckle. though some of our fellow residents seem determined to behave as though they were decades younger. Mrs. Merriweather has been practicing her waltz all morning, I understand. It must be gratifying for her to have an opportunity to display her talents again, Miss Marple observed mildly. Dr. Fletcher adjusted his spectacles. There's something to be said for growing old gracefully rather than clinging to past glories. But then, I was only ever a simple doctor, not someone accustomed to applause. He settled into a chair opposite her, opening his book but not appearing to read it. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice lower. I understand you have something of a reputation for insight into difficult matters, Miss Marple. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Oh dear, I'm afraid Harriet does exaggerate. My small village experiences. Perhaps, but sometimes an outside perspective can be valuable. He hesitated. Have you formed any impressions of Mrs. Preston? I've scarcely exchanged more than pleasantries with her, Miss Marple demurred. Count yourself fortunate, Dr. Fletcher said dryly. The woman has a talent for disruption that is quite remarkable. Since her arrival, the peaceful routine of Warbling Wood has been quite overthrown. Before Miss Marple could reply, the library door opened again to admit Colonel Bastow, who appeared mildly surprised to find it occupied. Beg pardon, he said, stiffly. Didn't mean to intrude. Not at all, Dr. Fletcher replied. We were just discussing this evening's entertainment. Entertainment? The colonel's mustache twitched with disapproval. Dancing and frivolity at our age, undignified, if you ask me. No one is obliged to participate, Dr. Fletcher pointed out. Attendance is expected, the colonel countered. Lady Harriet made that quite clear. For the good of the establishment, she said. Something in his tone caught Miss Marple's attention. There was resentment there, certainly, but perhaps something more, a kind of suppressed emotion that seemed at odds with his military bearing. I'm sure it will be a most pleasant evening, Miss Marple offered. And celebrations are so important, for marking the passage of time, don't you think? The colonel's gaze fixed on her with sudden intensity. Time, Miss Marple, has a way of revealing truths one might prefer to keep hidden. Remember that. With a curt nod, he departed, leaving Miss Marple with a curious sense that his words had contained a warning, though whether for her or for someone else she could not say. The grand hall of Warbling Wood Manor had been transformed by evening. Flowers adorned every surface. Soft lighting from the chandeliers cast a gentle glow over the proceedings, and a small orchestra had been established in one corner. The residents, dressed in their finest evening wear, mingled with the visitors in a scene that might have been lifted from decades past. Miss Marple, in a gown of silver-gray silk that had been carefully preserved over the years, observed the gathering with interest. Mrs. Merriweather was resplendent in deep emerald that matched her ring, while Mr. Hartley cut a distinguished figure in his perfectly tailored evening clothes. Dr. Fletcher appeared uncomfortable in his formal attire, tugging occasionally at his collar as though it constrained him, and Colonel Bastow, despite his earlier protests, had turned out in full military regalia, his medals gleaming under the lights. Mrs. Preston made a late entrance that seemed calculated to draw attention. Her gown of midnight blue was more modern in cut than those of the other ladies, and she wore a striking necklace of sapphires that caught the light with every movement. Miss Marple noticed that Mr. Hartley deliberately turned away as she entered, engaging Lady Harriet in animated conversation. Dinner was served at a series of round tables in the adjacent dining room, each adorned with silver candelabra and fresh flowers. Miss Marple found herself seated with Lady Harriet, Mrs. Preston, and a local magistrate and his wife. The conversation flowed pleasantly enough, though there was a moment of tension when Mrs. Preston abruptly changed the subject. "I've been meaning to discuss my plans for Warbling Wood," she announced, addressing Lady Harriet but speaking loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "I've decided to fund a complete renovation of the East Wing. The architect's plans will be ready next week." A surprised silence fell over the immediate vicinity. "My dear Mrs. Preston," Lady Harriet said with careful control, "any such plans would need to be discussed with the Residence Committee and approved by the Carmichael Trust." Mrs. Preston waved a bejeweled hand dismissively. "Mere formalities. With the amount I'm prepared to contribute, I can't imagine there will be any objections. The place is charming but desperately in need of modernization." From a nearby table, Miss Marple heard Colonel Bastow's distinct humph of disapproval, while Dr. Fletcher was observed to shake his head slightly. After dinner, the company returned to the grand hall for dancing. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Mr. Hartley, with pointed deliberation, invited Mrs. Merriweather to dance. They made a striking couple, both possessed of natural grace that the years had dimmed but not extinguished. Miss Marple noted the way Mrs. Preston's gaze followed them, her fingers tightening visibly around the stem of her champagne glass. "They've always moved well together," Lady Harriet remarked quietly at Miss Marple's side. "Even 50 years ago, they were the pair everyone watched at any gathering." As the evening progressed, Mrs. Merriweather was prevailed upon to give a short demonstration of the waltz, as it would have been performed in her dancing days. Mr. Hartley partnered her, and for a few moments it was possible to glimpse the young couple they had once been, captured in the photographs Miss Marple had seen. The applause was genuine and warm, but Miss Marple's attention was caught by 3 distinct reactions: the frank admiration in Lady Harriet's eyes, the unmistakable jealousy in Mrs. Preston's rigid posture, and the dark, almost pained expression that crossed Colonel Bastow's face before he abruptly excused himself from the gathering. Shortly thereafter, Mrs. Preston also departed, declining offers of assistance with a brittle smile and stating that she merely wished for some fresh air before retiring. Miss Marple, feeling the fatigue that comes to those of advanced years after an evening of stimulation, soon made her own excuses to Lady Harriet. As she climbed the stairs to her room, she reflected that beneath the surface of pleasant celebration, currents of old emotions had been stirring throughout the evening, currents that might yet prove dangerous. She could not have known how prophetic that thought would prove. For even as she prepared for bed, a cry of alarm rose from the gardens below, followed by the sound of running feet and urgent voices. And in the ornate gazebo that stood amid the roses of Warbling Wood, the body of Mrs. Eleanor Preston lay quite still, the silver gleam of an antique candlestick on the ground beside her, its once pristine surface now marred with darker stains. Chapter 4. Shadows of Suspicion. Morning brought a somber atmosphere to Warbling Wood Manor. The celebratory decorations from the previous evening remained, creating a jarring contrast with the hushed voices and concerned expressions of both staff and residents. Miss Marple, having risen early as was her custom, found Lady Harriet in the morning room, pale-faced and distressed. "The police have been here since dawn," Lady Harriet said, her usual composure notably absent. "Inspector Crouch, he's from the county police. They've closed off the gazebo and gardens entirely." "A most distressing occurrence," Miss Marple said gently. "Poor Mrs. Preston." Lady Harriet pressed her fingers to her temples. "I simply cannot believe it, Jane. We've never had anything like this happen at Warbling Wood. A regrettable accident, perhaps, or even, forgive me for saying so, a natural passing. These things one might expect among residents of our age. But murder? It's unconscionable. The door opened to admit Dr. Fletcher, looking weary. "I've just spoken with the police surgeon," he said without preamble. "He agrees with my preliminary assessment. Mrs. Preston died from a severe blow to the back of the head, delivered with considerable force. The candlestick found beside her appears to be the weapon. One of our Georgian silver candlesticks from the dining room," Lady Harriet murmured. "How dreadful." A brisk knock preceded the entrance of a tall, thin man with keen gray eyes and a methodical manner. He was accompanied by a uniformed constable who remained discreetly by the door. "Inspector Crouch." He introduced himself with a brief nod. "I understand you're a guest here, Miss Marple?" "Yes," replied Lady Harriet. "Miss Jane Marple, an old friend of mine from St. Mary Mead." The inspector's expression changed subtly. "Not the Miss Marple who assisted in the Gossington Hall affair?" "You are very kind to remember," Miss Marple said modestly. "I merely happened to observe certain parallels with a case involving our local organist's nephew." "Sir Henry Clithering speaks very highly of your insights," Inspector Crouch said with what might almost have been a smile. "A most fortunate coincidence to find you here, Miss Marple. I'd be grateful for any observations you might care to share." The questioning began in earnest then, as Inspector Crouch established the events of the previous evening. Each resident was interviewed separately in the library, while a constable maintained a discreet presence in the hallway to ensure privacy. Miss Marple, having given her own statement, which contained little of direct relevance as she had retired before the discovery of the body, was invited by Inspector Crouch to remain present during subsequent interviews, a courtesy which raised Lady Harriet's eyebrows, but which Miss Marple accepted with a simple nod. Colonel Bastow was the first to be questioned after luncheon, his military bearing more pronounced than ever as he faced the inspector across the library table. "I retired to my room immediately after Mrs. Merriweather's dance exhibition," he stated firmly. "You left rather abruptly," Inspector Crouch observed. Several witnesses noted it. The colonel's mustache twitched. "Didn't feel well. Touch of indigestion. Nothing unusual at my age." "And your relationship with Mrs. Preston?" "Barely knew the woman," he said curtly. "Arrived only a month ago. Kept herself rather aloof, except when making pronouncements about her plans for the place." "You disagreed with these plans?" the inspector pressed. "Certainly did." The colonel's face flushed slightly. "Impertinent, I call it. Warbling Wood has traditions, standards. Can't have some newcomer sweeping in with talk of modernization and renovations without proper consultation." "You argued with her about this?" The colonel hesitated. "Had words, yes. 2 days ago. Nothing serious, merely expressed my opinion that the residence committee should be consulted before any plans were finalized." "I see," said Inspector Crouch, making a note. "And your whereabouts between 10:30 and 11:30 last night?" "In my room, as I said. Reading military history. Lights out at precisely 11, as always." "Can anyone confirm this?" The colonel's flush deepened. "I live alone, Inspector. Have done for many years." After he had been dismissed, Miss Marple observed, quietly, "The colonel seems to value order and tradition most highly." Inspector Crouch nodded, and Mrs. Preston represented disruption to that order. Motive enough, perhaps. Dr. Fletcher was next, his manner carefully professional. "I examined the body briefly before the police surgeon arrived," he explained. "Mrs. Preston had been dead approximately 30 minutes when she was discovered by the gardener's boy, who had been sent to secure the grounds for the night." "And before that?" the inspector asked. "Your movements during the evening?" I was present throughout the festivities, though dancing has never been my forte, Dr. Fletcher replied. I left the hall at approximately 10:15 to get some air. The heat and noise were becoming rather oppressive. Did you go to the gardens? Briefly, yes. I walked along the West Terrace and observed the stars for perhaps 10 minutes. Then I returned inside and joined a discussion about recent medical advances with Sir James Porter, one of the trustees who was in attendance. And Mrs. Preston, your impressions of her? Dr. Fletcher hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. Professionally speaking, she was in good health for a woman of her age. Personally, he paused again. I found her somewhat disruptive to the harmony of Warbling Wood. In what way? Mrs. Preston had a tendency to remind people of matters they might prefer to forget, he said carefully. She seemed to take a certain pleasure in it. After Dr. Fletcher departed, Miss Marple remarked, there was something he wasn't telling. You, Inspector. Indeed, Miss Marple. And what might that be? I couldn't say precisely, she replied. But it reminded me rather of Dr. Rollins in our village when questioned about the Sanderson family's medical history. That same careful choice of words, you understand. Mrs. Violet Merriweather arrived for her interview in a subdued version of her usual elegance, though the emerald ring still adorned her finger. Such a dreadful business, she said, settling gracefully into the chair. Poor Eleanor. Though we had our differences, one would never wish such a fate upon anyone. You knew Mrs. Preston before her arrival at Warbling Wood? Inspector Crouch asked sharply. Mrs. Merriweather seemed momentarily flustered. That is, by reputation only. The social circles of London were quite interlinked in those days. You understand. One heard names, attended the same events, without necessarily making personal acquaintance. I see, said the inspector, making a note. And yesterday evening, your movements after your dance performance. I received so many kind compliments, Mrs. Merriweather said, touching her hair self-consciously. It was most gratifying. I believe I spoke with Lady Harriet, then with the chairman of the trust. Gerald, Mr. Hartley, fetched me a glass of champagne, and we reminisced about performances of years gone by. I noticed Mrs. Preston leave, of course, but thought nothing of it. Many of us find late evenings taxing at our age. Did you go outside at any point? Certainly not. The evening air plays havoc with my joints these days. The price one pays for years of dancing, I'm afraid. When Mrs. Merriweather had departed, Inspector Crouch turned to Miss Marple. She seems particularly interested in Mrs. Preston's belongings. My constable observed her watching most intently when we removed certain items from the deceased's room. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Merriweather strikes me as a lady who values beautiful things. That emerald ring, for instance, quite a remarkable piece for someone who described herself as having been merely a dancer. Lastly came Mr. Hartley, his usual charm subdued but still evident as he greeted Inspector Crouch. A shocking business, he said, shaking his head. Poor Eleanor, though I can't pretend we were on the best of terms. Indeed. And why was that? Ancient history, Inspector, he replied with a dismissive gesture. Eleanor and I moved in the same circles many years ago. We had a disagreement over a personal matter. Nothing relevant to current circumstances, I assure you. I'll be the judge of relevance, if you don't mind, Inspector Crouch said dryly. Where were you between 10:30 and 11:30 last night? And you? The hall until 11 hours, conversing with various guests and residents. Then I escorted Lady Harriet to her room. She was quite fatigued by the evening's events, and retired to my own quarters. Did you see or hear anything unusual? Nothing whatsoever, Mr. Hartley stated firmly. The first I knew of any trouble was when I heard the commotion from the gardens. As the library door closed behind Mr. Hartley, Miss Marple said quietly, "It reminds me somewhat of the case of Tommy Bond and Elsie Martin from St. Mary Mead." "In what way?" asked Inspector Crouch, who had come to respect these seemingly tangential observations. "There was a broken engagement some 40 years ago," Miss Marple explained. "Quite forgotten by most, or so one would have thought. But when Elsie returned to the village after her husband's death, certain old feelings resurfaced most unexpectedly." Inspector Crouch regarded her thoughtfully. "You believe there was a romantic connection between Mr. Hartley and the deceased?" "I couldn't possibly say," Miss Marple demurred. "But in my experience, Inspector, very few emotions are more dangerous than those that have been left to ferment over decades." The caretaker, Mr. Simmons, proved to be a man of late middle age with a weathered face and careful speech. His testimony established a timeline that gave alibis to some residents, but left critical gaps for others. The staff had been busy with the event, he explained, and while the main doors had been attended throughout, the garden doors had remained unlocked for the convenience of guests until 11, when I had begun the process of securing the building for the night. As dusk fell over Warbling Wood Manor, Inspector Crouch prepared to depart, promising to return the following morning. "The residents have been requested to remain available, effectively confined to the estate until further notice. I would value your continued observations, Miss Marple," he said as he collected his notes. "Lady Harriet has confirmed you're welcome to extend your stay." "It's most distressing to impose during such tragic circumstances," Miss Marple replied. "But if I can be of any assistance to you or to dear Harriet, naturally I shall remain." She watched from the window as the police car departed down the long drive, its headlights cutting through the gathering gloom. Behind her, the great house seemed to hold its breath, its residents moving quietly through rooms still adorned with fading flowers from the celebration that now seemed to belong to another lifetime altogether. Chapter 5. The Dancing Years. The following day brought a persistent drizzle that shrouded Warbling Wood in a gray mist, lending the manor a somber aspect that matched the mood of its occupants. Miss Marple sat by the window of the small morning room, her knitting needles moving with steady precision as she contemplated the events of the previous days. Outside, a police constable paced methodically along the gravel path, his uniform dark with moisture. Lady Harriet entered, carrying a silver tray with tea things. "I've dismissed Mary for the morning," she explained, setting down the tray. "The poor girl is quite distraught. Mrs. Preston was not the easiest resident, but murder—" She broke off, shaking her head. "The staff are terribly upset." "Naturally," Miss Marple replied, setting aside her knitting. "It's a most disturbing occurrence, particularly in a place that has been so peaceful." Lady Harriet poured the tea with a hand that trembled slightly. "Inspector Craddock telephoned earlier. They've completed their examination of the scene. The gardens will be accessible again, though I can't imagine anyone will wish to visit the gazebo for some time." Miss Marple accepted her cup with a thoughtful expression. "Harriet, you mentioned that many of the residents knew each other in London during the 1930s. I wonder, was Mrs. Preston also part of that circle?" Lady Harriet hesitated, stirring her tea longer than necessary. "I believe so, though she arrived at Warbling Wood under her married name, of course. It was only after she settled in that certain recognitions occurred." "I see," Miss Marple said gently. "And her maiden name was Eliza Carmichael," a voice supplied from the doorway. They turned to find Mrs. Merriweather standing there, her usual elegance somewhat diminished by the strain evident in her face. "I apologize for interrupting," she said, advancing into the room, "but I couldn't help overhearing your question. Miss Marple, and you should know that Eleanor, or Eliza, as she was then, was indeed very much part of our London set. Quite the social sensation, in fact." "Violet," Lady Harriet said in a warning tone, "I'm not sure this is the time." "On the contrary," Mrs. Merriweather replied, seating herself uninvited. "With poor Eleanor dead, certain truths might as well emerge. They're bound to, once the police begin digging more deeply." Miss Marple observed the tension between the two women with interest. "Mrs. Preston was related to the Carmichaels who owned this house originally?" "A distant cousin," Lady Harriet supplied reluctantly. "The branch that made its fortune in shipping rather than land, and quite determined to remind everyone of it," Mrs. Merriweather added. "Her arrival at Warbling Wood was no coincidence, you know. She had plans for this place. That business about funding renovations was just the beginning." Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet rhythm. It must have been quite a shock for the other residents who had known her in the past. For some more than others, Mrs. Merriweather said with a significant glance at Lady Harriet, who busied herself with the tea things. Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. Inspector Craddock entered, accompanied by a young constable carrying a cardboard box. "Good morning, ladies," he said with a nod. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. We've completed our preliminary examination of Mrs. Preston's room and belongings." "Have you discovered anything of importance, Inspector?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "Several items of interest," he replied, gesturing to the constable to set down the box, "including this which Lady Harriet might be able to help us with." He withdrew, a small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. A dance program from 1935, found in Mrs. Preston's bedside drawer. It appears to be from an event held here at Warbling Wood when it was still a private residence. Lady Harriet accepted the booklet with evident surprise. The Midsummer Ball. The Carmichaels hosted it annually before the war, but why would Eleanor have kept this particular program all these years? Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Perhaps the names it contains hold some significance." Inspector Craddock nodded approvingly. "Precisely my thought, Miss Marple. There are several names marked with pencil notations, including those of our current residents, Mr. Hartley, Colonel Barstow, Dr. Fletcher, and Mrs. Merriweather." Mrs. Merriweather reached for the program with undisguised interest. "May I?" "Ah, yes. I remember this event vividly. I danced the opening waltz with—" She stopped abruptly, her expression changing. "How curious." "What is it, Mrs. Merriweather?" the inspector prompted. "These markings beside the names," she said slowly. "They're not just checks or underlines. They're tiny symbols, a heart, a question mark, a small cross." "A sort of code, perhaps?" suggested Miss Marple, her knitting. "Momentarily forgotten? Or simply the social notations of a young woman tracking her dance partners," Lady Harriet said dismissively. Inspector Craddock retrieved the program carefully. "Nevertheless, it seems significant that Mrs. Preston preserved this particular memento, and that it contains references to current residents of Warbling Wood." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way slowly up to her room. The corridor was quiet, most residents keeping to themselves in the aftermath of the murder. As she passed Mrs. Preston's room, now sealed with police tape, she noticed Colonel Barstow standing at the far end of the hallway, staring at the door with an inscrutable expression. He started slightly upon seeing Miss Marple and quickly turned away. In the privacy of her room, Miss Marple sat down at the small writing desk and began to make notes. The connections between the residents were becoming clearer, yet the precise nature of their shared past, and how it might have led to murder, remained tantalizingly obscure. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Mary, the young maid, her face pale but composed. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but Lady Harriet thought you might like to know that the police have finished questioning the gardener. He's been with the estate for over 40 years, since before it became a residence, and Lady Harriet thought you might, well," she hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with her mission, "that I might wish to speak with him?" Miss Marple supplied gently. Mary nodded, relieved. "He's in the potting shed now, miss. If you were to take a turn in the east garden, you'd likely encounter him." The rain had eased to a fine mist as Miss Marple made her way carefully along the flagstone path that wound through the east garden. The potting shed was a sturdy structure of weathered brick, nestled against the old garden wall. The door stood ajar, and from within came the earthy scent of soil and the sound of someone moving about. "Good morning," Miss Marple called softly. "Might I come in for a moment?" The gardener proved to be a stooped, weathered man with intelligent eyes that regarded her shrewdly from beneath bushy white eyebrows. He introduced himself as Perkins and offered her the only seat, a rough wooden stool, which she accepted gratefully. "Lady Harriet suggested I might speak with you," Miss Marple began. "I understand you've been with Warbling Wood for many years." "Since I was a lad of 14, he confirmed, continuing to pot seedlings as he spoke. "Worked under my father at first, then took over as head gardener when he passed. Seen the place through all its changes, including its conversion to a residence for elderly gentlefolk. Better than seeing it torn down or sold off in parcels like many of the old estates," Miss Marple observed. Aye, his gnarled hands worked deftly among the plants. "Sad business, this murder. Never thought I'd see such a thing here. I understand Mrs. Preston had only recently arrived at Warbling Wood." "Month ago," he confirmed, though not her first time here, of course. Miss Marple's interest quickened. "Oh, used to visit before the war. One of the young ladies who came for the summer balls and garden parties." He glanced up briefly. "Recognized her straight off despite the years. Some faces you don't forget." "And did she recognize you?" A brief smile creased his weathered face. "Doubt she ever noticed me back then. I was just a gardener's boy. But she knew the place right enough. Saw her walking the grounds her first day here like she was looking for something. And then flowers started coming for her a day later." "Flowers?" Miss Marple inquired, her needles momentarily still. "White roses. Delivered weekly. No card. Just the instruction they were for Mrs. Preston." He shook his head slightly. "Thought it might be family at first, but she seemed right puzzled by them herself." Miss Marple considered this new information thoughtfully. Anonymous flowers suggested a secret admirer, or perhaps something more complex. In her experience, gestures that appeared romantic on the surface could sometimes mask darker intentions. "Did you mention these flowers to Inspector Craddock?" she asked. "I did," though he seemed more interested in who had access to the gardens. "On the night of the murder." Perkins straightened with a slight wince, one hand going to his lower back. "Told him anyone could have come through the south gate. It doesn't lock proper, hasn't for years. Mentioned it to Mr. Simmons time and again, but there's always something more pressing needing repair." As Miss Marple made her way back to the house, she reflected on this new information. The dance program with its curious markings, the anonymous white roses, Mrs. Preston's apparent interest in something on the grounds, all suggested a complex web of past relationships and present tensions centered around the murdered woman. From an upper window, she noticed Dr. Fletcher watching her return. From the gardens, his expression unreadable behind the glint of his spectacles. He withdrew quickly when she glanced up, like a man unwilling to be caught observing others. The pieces of the puzzle were accumulating, Miss Marple thought, as she carefully mounted the steps to the terrace. Yet how they fit together and what picture they might ultimately reveal remained as misty and indistinct as the gardens of Warbling Wood themselves on this gray, somber morning. Chapter 6. Faded Photographs. That afternoon, a constable arrived bearing a small wooden box that had been discovered at the back of Mrs. Preston's wardrobe during a more thorough search of her room. Inspector Craddock, who had remained at the local police station completing paperwork, had instructed that it be brought directly to the morning room, where Miss Marple sat with Lady Harriet, and by chance, Dr. Fletcher. "The inspector thought you might be able to identify some of the contents, ma'am," the young constable explained to Lady Harriet, placing the box on the table with careful hands. "He said Miss Marple might wish to be present." The box was of polished mahogany, inlaid with mother-of-pearl in an elegant pattern. Lady Harriet regarded it with reluctant interest. "I've never seen this before," she said, "though the craftsmanship looks like it might be from the 30s. Dr. Fletcher leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. "A keepsake box by the look of it. Rather like one my mother owned." When opened, the box revealed a collection of photographs, their black and white images slightly faded with age but still clearly visible. Miss Marple, who had been invited to examine them, spread several carefully on the table. "These appear to have been taken here at Warbling Wood," she observed, "and judging by the fashions, I would say in the mid-1930s. Lady Harriet picked up one of the photographs, her expression softening. "The summer of '35, I believe. Look at the rose arbor. It was at its finest that year. Perkins's father was so proud of those blooms." The photographs revealed scenes of elegant garden parties, tennis matches on the now-defunct court, and formally dressed couples posed on the terrace. Many faces recurred across the images, younger versions of the current residents, recognizable despite the passage of time. One photograph in particular caught Miss Marple's attention. A group posed beside the very gazebo where Mrs. Preston's body had been found. In it, a striking young woman in a light-colored dress stood slightly apart from the others, her expression confident, almost challenging. Behind her, partially in shadow, stood a young man in military uniform, his face serious. "Is that Colonel Barstow?" Miss Marple inquired, indicating the figure. Dr. Fletcher leaned closer. "Indeed it is. Much younger, of course, but unmistakable. And the young lady must be Eliza Carmichael, Mrs. Preston, as she was then." "She was quite beautiful," Miss Marple remarked. "Beauty can be a dangerous gift," Dr. Fletcher said quietly. "It tends to make its possessor believe that the ordinary rules don't apply." "You speak as though you knew her well," Lady Harriet observed, a question in her tone. Dr. Fletcher straightened, his expression closing. "I knew of her, naturally. Our circles overlapped occasionally in London. I was just beginning my practice then." Miss Marple continued to sort through the photographs, pausing at one that showed a tennis foursome, Mr. Hartley and Mrs. Merriweather. "Then Miss Violet Derwent," Lady Harriet explained, "partnered against Eliza Carmichael and another young man whose face was partially turned away from the camera." "One does wonder why Mrs. Preston kept these particular photographs all these years," Miss Marple mused, "and why she brought them to Warbling Wood." "Perhaps as souvenirs of happier times," suggested Lady Harriet, though she sounded unconvinced. "Or as evidence," Dr. Fletcher said abruptly, then looked as though he regretted speaking. Evidence of what, doctor? Miss Marple inquired mildly. He hesitated. I merely meant that photographs can serve as records of events and relationships that might otherwise be disputed. In my professional experience, patients with certain concerns about their memory often keep such tangible reminders. Before Miss Marple could pursue this intriguing statement, they were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Hartley, who entered the morning room with his usual grace, though his customary charm seemed somewhat dimmed. "I've been looking for you, lady." "Harriet," he began, then stopped short at the sight of the photographs spread across the table. "Good Lord, where did these come from?" "They were among Mrs. Preston's possessions," Lady Harriet explained. "The police thought we might help identify the people in them." Mr. Hartley approached slowly, as if reluctant to come too near. "I had no idea she had kept these," he said, his voice strangely tight. "After all these years—" "You and Mrs. Preston were well acquainted in those days?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Mr. Hartley picked up one of the photographs, a garden scene, in which he stood beside Eliza Carmichael, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's view. "We were close for a time," he admitted, very briefly. "It came to nothing." "She broke your heart, as I recall," Dr. Fletcher said with unusual directness, "along with several others." Mr. Hartley's expression hardened momentarily. "Ancient history, doctor, hardly relevant to present circumstances." "On the contrary," Miss Marple interjected softly, "in my experience, very few things are more relevant to the present than the unresolved wounds of the past." Mr. Hartley replaced the photograph carefully. "If you'll excuse me," he said with a slight bow, "I find I'm rather in need of some fresh air." After he had departed, Lady Harriet sighed. "Poor Gerald. I had no idea he and Eleanor had once been involved." "There seems to be a great deal about the past that has remained unspoken," Miss Marple observed, gathering the photographs together, "until Mrs. Preston's arrival brought it back to the surface." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Dr. Fletcher, finding him in the library, where he appeared to be reading a medical journal, though his abstracted expression suggested his thoughts were elsewhere. "Might I have a word, doctor, did I?" inquired. Settling into the chair opposite him, he closed his journal with careful precision. "Of course, Miss Marple. How may I assist you?" "I understand from Lady Harriet that Mrs. Preston consulted you professionally after her arrival at Warbling." "Would." His expression remained neutral. "I occasionally offer informal consultations to my fellow residents. Nothing that would violate my oath, you understand." "Naturally," Miss Marple agreed. "I was merely wondering if Mrs. Preston had expressed any particular concerns about her health." Dr. Fletcher hesitated, clearly weighing his professional discretion against the circumstances of murder. "I suppose, given the situation, I can tell you that Mrs. Preston had been diagnosed with a condition of the heart. She believed, whether correctly or not, I couldn't say without more extensive tests, that she had perhaps a year remaining." Miss Marple absorbed this information with a thoughtful nod. "Did she seem distressed by this prognosis?" "On the contrary," Dr. Fletcher replied, "she seemed almost satisfied, if that doesn't sound too strange, as though it gave her a certain urgency of purpose." "The purpose being her plans for Warbling Wood?" "Perhaps," he conceded, though I gathered there was something more personal involved as well. She made a rather cryptic remark about having accounts to settle before her time was up. As she left the library, Miss Marple encountered Colonel Barstow, who appeared to have been lingering in the corridor. His manner was unusually agitated, his customary military bearing less evident than before. "Miss Marple," he said, falling, into step beside her. "I understand the police found some old photographs in Mrs. Preston's room." "Indeed," she replied. "From the summer of 1935. It appears you were among those pictured." The colonel's jaw tightened. "I was stationed nearby that summer before being posted abroad. Attended a few social functions here at the invitation of the Carmichaels." He hesitated, then added stiffly, "I hope you won't think it intrusive, but I would be most interested in viewing these photographs, for old time's sake." "I believe Inspector Craddock has taken them as potential evidence," Miss Marple said apologetically, "though I did notice you were standing quite near Miss Carmichael, as she was then in one particular image." The colonel's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a momentary freezing of his expression before he recovered his composure. "Was I? I scarcely remember. It was a long time ago." As he walked away, Miss Marple reflected that Colonel Barstow's memory seemed remarkably selective. The man in that photograph had been looking at Eliza Carmichael with an intensity that suggested she was not merely a casual acquaintance from a handful of social occasions. In the late afternoon, as Miss Marple made her way to the drawing room for tea, she noticed Mrs. Merriweather emerging from the direction of what had been Mrs. Preston's room, now temporarily sealed with police tape. Seeing Miss Marple, Mrs. Merriweather started visibly, her hand going to her throat in a nervous gesture. "I was just," she began, then stopped. "That is, I thought I heard something. A window, perhaps, blown open by the draft. I was merely investigating." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I believe Constable Morris is stationed at the end of the corridor for just such purposes." Mrs. Merriweather's smile was strained. "Of course. Silly of me to forget." During tea, served by an unusually subdued Mary, Miss Marple noticed a sheet of music that had been left on the piano in the corner of the drawing room. Excusing herself from Lady Harriet's company, she crossed to examine it. The piece was titled "The Last Waltz," a popular composition from the 1920s. As Miss Marple turned the pages, she noticed that one corner had been torn, as though someone had ripped off a portion of the margin. Turning the sheet over, she found writing on the back, a partial message in faded ink, cut off where the paper had been torn. "Never forget what you did. The truth will come out, even after all these." The rest was missing, leaving the ominous message incomplete. Miss Marple was still contemplating this discovery when Mrs. Merriweather entered the drawing room. Upon seeing Miss Marple by the piano, her face drained of color, and she swayed alarmingly. "Violet!" Lady Harriet exclaimed, rising quickly. "Are you unwell?" Mrs. Merriweather's hand clutched at the doorframe for support. I just remembered something," she said faintly. "About the night of the murder. Something important." Before she could elaborate, her eyes rolled upward and she collapsed in a graceful heap to the floor, the emerald ring on her finger catching the light as her hand fell limply at her side. Chapter 7. Patterns and Parallels Misses. Merriweather had been helped to her room by Lady Harriet and Mary, leaving Miss Marple alone in the drawing room with the torn sheet of music still in her hand. She carefully replaced it on the piano before making her way upstairs. The corridor outside Mrs. Merriweather's room was quiet, and she knocked gently on the door. "Come in," called a voice that had recovered some of its usual composure. Miss Marple entered to find Mrs. Merriweather reclining on a chaise longue, a lace handkerchief pressed to her forehead. Lady Harriet had evidently departed, though a glass of water and a small bottle of smelling salts remained on the side table. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Merriweather said, extending a pale hand, How kind of you to check on an old woman's foolishness. These episodes are so embarrassing. Not at all, Miss Marple replied, settling into a nearby chair. A most natural reaction, considering the distressing circumstances we find ourselves in. Mrs. Merriweather's gaze was sharper than her languid pose might suggest. You're very understanding. I wonder, though, what you make of our little tragedy here at Warbling Wood. I couldn't possibly say, Miss Marple demurred. Inspector Craddock is conducting a most thorough investigation. But you have your thoughts, Mrs. Merriweather persisted. One can see it in your eyes. Such observant eyes. You notice things others might miss. Miss Marple smiled gently. At my age, observation becomes a habit, though I'm often reminded of similar situations in my village of St. Mary Mead. Have you observed a similar situation to this? There was an undercurrent of tension beneath Mrs. Merriweather's casual tone. Before you fainted, Miss Marple said quietly, you mentioned remembering something important about the night of the murder? Mrs. Merriweather's fingers played nervously with the emerald ring. Did I? How strange. The mind plays such tricks when one is overcome. She hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. I did see something that night, after my waltz performance. Eleanor, Mrs. Preston, was speaking with someone near the French doors. They appeared to be arguing, though I couldn't hear the words. Could you identify this person? Miss Marple asked. Before Mrs. Merriweather could answer, they were interrupted by a brisk knock. The door opened to admit Inspector Craddock, his expression grave. Ah, Miss Marple, I've been looking for you. He nodded to Mrs. Merriweather. I understand you had a turn earlier, madam. I hope you're recovering. Quite recovered, thank you, Inspector, Mrs. Merriweather replied, though her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her shawl. I've just received some information that may be relevant to our case, Inspector Craddock continued, addressing Miss Marple. It appears that the murder weapon, the Georgian silver candlestick, was part of a pair donated to Warbling Wood some years ago by Mr. Hartley. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured. A personal connection to the weapon, as it were. Indeed. I'll be speaking with Mr. Hartley shortly. The inspector turned back to Mrs. Merriweather. When you're feeling stronger, madam, I'd like to continue our earlier conversation about your movements on the night of the murder. After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple made her excuses, promising to return later when Mrs. Merriweather had rested. As she closed the door, she couldn't help but notice the expression of relief that crossed the former dancer's face. The remainder of the afternoon passed quietly as Miss Marple established herself in a comfortable chair in the library, her knitting in her lap, though her hands remained still. She had developed the habit over many years of appearing to be occupied with wool and needles, while her mind worked on more complex patterns. The residents of Warbling Wood largely kept to themselves, the shock of murder having disrupted their usual routines. Occasionally, Miss Marple observed one or another passing the library door. Dr. Fletcher with his medical journal, Lady Harriet consulting with Mr. Simmons about household matters, Colonel Barstow taking his precisely timed afternoon constitutional. It was the colonel who caught her attention most particularly. There was something in his bearing that reminded her of Major Curtis from St. Mary Mead, a man who had maintained a military facade for decades while nursing a private grief that eventually led to tragic consequences. A case of misdirected blame, Miss Marple murmured to herself, her fingers finally beginning to work the needles. So very dangerous when allowed to fester over time. Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who closed the library door behind him with unusual care. I thought you might like to know, he said without preamble, "that we've been examining Mrs. Preston's financial arrangements. It seems she made changes to her will quite recently, just 3 weeks ago, in fact." "After her arrival at Warbling Wood," Miss Marple noted. "Precisely. The bulk of her considerable estate is now directed to the Carmichael Trust for the maintenance and improvement of Warbling Wood Manor." "A generous bequest," Miss Marple observed, "though perhaps not unexpected, given her family connection to the place." "There's more," Inspector Craddock continued, seating himself opposite her. "The will contains a specific clause excluding certain individuals from any involvement in how the funds are to be used, and these individuals are Colonel Barstow and Mr. Hartley." The inspector leaned forward slightly. "It's most unusual, and quite specific. Neither gentleman is to have any input into decisions regarding the use of her bequest, nor are they to benefit directly or indirectly from any improvements funded by it." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "That suggests a very personal animosity, does it not?" "My thoughts exactly." Inspector Craddock hesitated. "There's something else. We've conducted a more thorough examination of the murder scene, the gazebo. Something struck me as odd about the positioning of the body and certain marks on the ground." "In what way?" Miss Marple inquired. "Mrs. Preston was found lying parallel to the garden bench, but from the blood pattern it appears she actually fell against it first, then slid to the ground. There were also 2 distinct sets of footprints in the soft earth around the gazebo steps, one belonging to the victim, the other larger, almost certainly a man's." "Suggesting that her assailant walked her to the gazebo, or met her there by arrangement," Miss Marple mused. "Exactly so. This doesn't appear to have been a chance encounter or an impulsive act. The killer likely arranged to meet Mrs. Preston in the gazebo during the ball." After the inspector left to continue his inquiries, Miss Marple decided that a breath of fresh air might help clarify her thoughts. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill, she made her way to the gardens. The gazebo, no longer cordoned off as a crime scene, stood empty and somehow forlorn among the roses. Miss Marple approached it slowly, noting the view it commanded of both the manor house and the gardens. A person standing here would see anyone approaching along the main paths, yet might remain relatively unobserved from the house, particularly after dark. She mounted the steps carefully and sat on the bench where, presumably, Mrs. Preston had been struck down. The position afforded a clear view of the French doors leading from the manor's grand hall, where the dancing had taken place. From here, Mrs. Preston might have watched the festivities while remaining apart from them. But why come here alone during the ball? Unless, of course, she had arranged to meet someone she trusted enough to follow into the darkness, or who had followed her. As Miss Marple rose to leave, her attention was caught by something glinting faintly between the wooden slats of the gazebo floor. Bending with the care necessitated by elderly joints, she discovered a small pearl button, such as might adorn an evening shirt or dress cuff. She had just slipped this small find into her pocket when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. Turning, she found Mr. Hartley regarding her with a mixture of surprise and weariness. "Miss Marple," he said, making an effort to summon his usual charm. "Taking in the evening air. I find it helps to clear the mind," she replied. "The gazebo offers such a pleasant prospect of the gardens and of the house," he observed, his gaze shifting to the manor. Eleanor always did prefer to observe rather than participate. Even in her younger days, she would sometimes withdraw from festivities to watch from a distance. "You knew her well, then," Miss Marple suggested gently. His expression clouded. "I thought I did once. But people change over the decades. Or perhaps they simply reveal their true selves more clearly with age. Later that evening, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she was startled by a soft knock at her door. It was Mary, the young maid, her face pale in the dim corridor lighting. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but Lady Harriet asked if you might join her in the attic. She's found something she thinks you should see." The attic of Warbling Wood Manor was a vast space beneath the eaves, illuminated now by a single electric bulb that cast long shadows among the trunks, furniture, and miscellaneous items accumulated. Over decades, Lady Harriet stood beside an open valise, her expression troubled. "Jane, I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour, but I felt this couldn't wait until morning." Mr. Simmons was checking for a roof leak and came across this old traveling case. It contains dance programs from the 1930s, dozens of them, all from events held here at Warbling Wood. Miss Marple examined the valise and its contents with interest. The programs were arranged chronologically, each in its original condition, with penciled notations similar to those they had seen in Mrs. Preston's possession. "Most curious," she murmured. "These appear to have been collected systematically." "There's more," Lady Harriet said, lifting a small leather-bound book from the bottom of the case. A diary, with entries corresponding to the dates of the programs. "And look at this particular entry." She opened the diary to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was delicate but clear. The ink faded to sepia with age. At the top of the page was a date, June 21st, 1935, and below it, a single name stood out prominently, Eliza Carmichael. Miss Marple looked up at Lady Harriet, whose troubled expression confirmed the significance of the discovery. Here was another thread in the increasingly complex tapestry of past relationships that had culminated in murder at Warbling Wood Manor. Chapter 8. The Last Waltz. The following afternoon found Warbling Wood Manor unusually quiet. Inspector Craddock had departed early that morning, mentioning the need to verify certain information at the county records office, but promising to return by tea time. The residents had largely kept to their rooms, the shadow of murder having subdued the usual gentle rhythms of the establishment. Miss Marple sat in the morning room with her knitting, though the half-formed scarf had progressed little in the past hour. Her mind was occupied with arranging the various pieces of information she had gathered, testing how they might fit together to form a coherent picture. Occasionally she would pause to make a small note in a notebook balanced on the arm of her chair. At precisely 4 miles back, she looked up to find Lady Harriet regarding her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You've been very thoughtful today, Jane," Lady Harriet observed. "I do hope you're not finding your visit too distressing." "Such a dreadful business," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I wonder if I might impose upon you for a small favor, Harriet. I should like to arrange a gathering in the drawing-room at 5 for a memorial tea for Mrs. Preston, as it were. If you could be so kind as to invite all the residents." Lady Harriet looked surprised. "A memorial tea? But surely it's too soon. The police investigation is still ongoing." "That is precisely why I think it would be appropriate," Miss Marple replied gently. "I've spoken with Inspector Craddock, who will be returning shortly. He agrees that bringing everyone together might help to clarify certain matters." Though clearly puzzled, Lady Harriet acquiesced to the request. Word was sent to the residents, and by 5 the drawing-room had been prepared. Mary and another maid had arranged a tea service more formal than usual, with the best china and silver teapot. Fresh flowers, though notably not white roses, had been placed on the small tables. One by one the residents arrived. Dr. Fletcher came first, his expression guarded behind his spectacles. Mrs. Merriweather followed, having evidently taken particular care with her appearance, her silver hair arranged elegantly and the emerald ring prominent on her finger. Mr. Hartley entered with a polite nod to the assembled company, though his customary charm seemed diminished. Colonel Barstow was the last to arrive, his military punctuality apparently abandoned as he slipped in just as Lady Harriet was about to pour the tea. Inspector Craddock stood unobtrusively by the French doors, his presence lending an air of official sanction to the proceedings. A young constable had positioned himself near the main entrance to the room. "How kind of you all to come," Miss Marple began, setting aside her knitting. "I thought it might be appropriate for us to gather in memory of Mrs. Preston, who, despite her brief time at Warbling Wood, had such strong connections to this place and to many of you." There was a murmur of polite agreement, though Miss Marple noted the tension evident in several faces. "In my village of St. Mary Mead," she continued, "we had a somewhat similar case some years ago. A lady who had left the village in her youth returned many years later, using her married name. Few recognized her at first, but she had not forgotten the connections and grievances of the past." "I fail to see the relevance," Colonel Barstow said abruptly, his fingers drumming a restless tattoo on the arm of his chair. "It is relevant, Colonel," Miss Marple replied gently, "because that lady, like Mrs. Preston, had come back with a purpose. In her case, it was to expose a long-hidden deception. In Mrs. Preston's case, I believe it was both more complex and more personal." She turned slightly to include the entire group in her gaze. Mrs. Preston, or Eliza Carmichael, as she was known in her youth, returned to Warbling Wood with a specific intention. Her heart condition gave her reason to believe her time was limited, and she wished to confront certain individuals about events from the summer of 1935. Dr. Fletcher stirred uncomfortably. "As I mentioned previously, she did allude to having accounts to settle." "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded. "The question, of course, is what these accounts might have been, and with whom." She reached into her knitting bag and withdrew the diary that had been found in the attic. "This diary, which Lady Harriet and I discovered last night, contains entries from that summer. It belonged not to Eliza Carmichael, but to another young lady who was part of the same social set." Mrs. Merriweather's hand went to her throat. "That's—" "Yes," Miss Marple confirmed. "It appears to have belonged to Margaret Barstow, the Colonel's sister, who was also a frequent visitor to Warbling Wood that summer." A stillness fell over the room. Colonel Barstow's face had gone quite rigid, his complexion ashen. "The diary contains several references to Eliza Carmichael," Miss Marple continued, "and to her relationship with a young man described only as G. Given the photographs we've seen, it seems reasonable to assume this referred to Mr. Hartley." Mr. Hartley shifted in his seat but said nothing, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Miss Marple's head. "The entry for June 21st, 1935 is particularly revealing," Miss Marple said, opening the diary. "It reads, 'He has taken G from me just as she promised she would. He has broken our engagement, saying he never truly loved me. I cannot bear the humiliation or the pain. There is nothing left for me now.'" Colonel Barstow's hands gripped the arms of his chair with such force that his knuckles showed white. "Stop this," he said hoarsely. "You have no right." "The diary continues with entries for another week," Miss Marple went on, her voice gentle but firm, "and then they cease abruptly. According to local records, which Inspector Craddock has kindly verified, Margaret Barstow took her own life on July 1st, 1935. A soft gasp came from Lady Harriet. Mrs. Merriweather closed her eyes briefly, while Dr. Fletcher removed his spectacles and began polishing them with methodical precision. Margaret's suicide was attributed to a nervous condition, Miss Marple explained. The true circumstances were, I believe, concealed to avoid scandal. She was buried quietly, and the matter was not spoken of again. But someone remembered, didn't they, Colonel Barstow? Someone held Eliza Carmichael responsible for the death of a beloved sister. The colonel's breathing had become audible, his military composure crumbling visibly. "You cannot possibly understand," he said at last. Margaret was the gentlest soul. That woman, Eliza, she destroyed her out of pure vanity. She had no interest in Hartley except as a conquest. She told Margaret so later, boasted of it. "And for this, after more than 4 decades, you took your revenge," Miss Marple said quietly. "You have no proof," the colonel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "On the contrary," Inspector Craddock interjected, stepping forward. "We have several pieces of evidence that, taken together, are quite compelling. The pearl button found at the scene matches those on your evening shirt. The precise timing of the murder corresponds to your absence from the ball. And there is the matter of the candlestick, a distinctive weapon that holds significance in this case." "The candlesticks were donated by Mr. Hartley," Miss Marple added. "A detail you would have known, making their use as the murder weapon a particularly calculated choice, implicating the very man for whom your sister's heart was broken." The colonel seemed to age before their eyes, his shoulders slumping as though under an unbearable weight. "She recognized me instantly," he said, his voice barely audible. "The moment she arrived at Warbling Wood. She smiled, actually smiled, and said, 'Why, Reggie Barstow, still carrying a torch after all these years? How terribly sweet.' As though Margaret's life and death had been nothing more than a minor social amusement." "So you arranged to meet her in the gazebo during the ball?" Inspector Craddock prompted. "I sent her a note," the colonel admitted, suggesting I had information about the Carmichael Trust that might interest her. She was eager enough to come, thinking it concerned her plans for the manor. He looked up, his eyes haunted. "I had no intention of killing her when I went to the gazebo. I wanted to confront her, to make her acknowledge what she had done. But she laughed, actually laughed, and said Margaret had always been too sensitive for her own good." The silence that followed was profound. Even Inspector Craddock seemed momentarily at a loss for words, in the face of such raw emotion from a cheered man who had maintained rigid control for so many decades. "Colonel Reginald Barstow," he said finally, "I am arresting you for the murder of Eleanor Preston. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." The colonel was led away. His military bearing reasserted itself, his back straight and his head held high. Yet there was something broken in his aspect that went beyond the circumstance of arrest. The collapse of a facade maintained for more than 40 years. The residents of Warbling Wood watched in stunned silence. Mrs. Merriweather dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief while Mr. Hartley stood at the window, his back to the room, his reflection in the glass showing a face lined with the weight of old regrets. "Such a waste," Lady Harriet murmured to Miss Marple as they sat together later that evening in the quiet of the morning room. "So many lives damaged beyond repair by events set in motion all those years ago." "The past is never truly past," Miss Marple replied, her needles moving gently in the lamplight. "It remains with us, shaping our actions in ways we may not always recognize." Poor Colonel Barstow carried his grief and anger for more than 40 years, allowing it to fester until it finally found expression in violence. And Eleanor, Eliza, returning here, stirring up those old memories. What could she have been thinking? I believe she came seeking some form of reconciliation in her own way, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Her heart condition had given her reason to contemplate her life and its effect on others. The bequest to the Carmichael Trust suggests a desire to make amends to the place, if not to the people she had harmed. But to exclude Gerald and the Colonel specifically in her will, that seems deliberately provocative. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded, or perhaps it was her way of acknowledging the pain she had caused them by removing herself from their lives even after her death. We shall never know now. Outside, the gardens of Warbling Wood lay peaceful in the gathering darkness, the gazebo a pale shape among the shadows. The anniversary celebrations had ended in tragedy, yet life at the manor would continue, shaped by, but not defined by, the events of the past week. Miss Marple's gaze fell upon her half-finished knitting, the pattern now clear and established, each stitch connected to those that had come before, forming a design that had been invisible in its early stages but was now unmistakable. Like the pattern of human actions and their consequences, she reflected, that became apparent only when viewed with the perspective that time and careful observation could provide. Thanks for joining us for the jealous fire of Warbling Wood. Did you suspect Colonel Barstow before Miss Marple revealed the connection to his sister? Were you intrigued by the significance of the old dance programs and photographs? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Miss Marple, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Miss Marple's wisdom. Human nature is much the same everywhere, and the quiet observer often sees what others miss. This is Ailey signing off from Café Tales.